Good morning, afternoon, and evening. I always say good morning because it's morning for me, and for many of you on the East Coast of the U.S., but many of you it is not morning. I'm Rachel Scheiderman. This is Daf Yomi Week in Review with My Jewish Learning. We are here on January 2nd, New Year 2025, and I'm pulling everybody in while I speak. And it is nice to see you all. Lots of familiar faces. I think some new faces too. And speaking of new faces, as you know, this class is taught by a rotating cast of wonderful teachers, and we have a new one for you today. This is Max Buchdal. Max was born and raised in Baltimore, and he has studied at Pardes and Yeshivat Drisha and Yeshivat Hadar. He has an MA in Talmud and Rabbinics from JTS. And he is currently studying for smicha, for rabbinic ordination at Yashrut, and we're really excited to learn with him today. Max, why don't you go ahead and take over?
Great. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you all. I'm going to share the source sheet in the chat now. My name is Max. Happy Hanukkah for the last time in 5785. And I'm coming to you from, I was born and raised in Baltimore. I live now in Washington Heights in New York City. And really excited to go ahead and to first of all to see where everyone's coming from in the chat. Lots of fun places. And also I figured there'd be at least one more New York person. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna, so you've got the source sheet in the chat. You can feel free to follow along there. And I'm also gonna share my screen as well. Okay. Great. So it's been a busy second week of Masechet Sanhedrin. We've covered a lot of ground already in really a sort of jam-packed Masechet, jam-packed tractate. Just to point out a couple of things that we saw this week, right? We saw a very long and complicated, it was long for me, sugya about Ibor, about the intercalation of the year. Right, so I hope you all had your calendars out for that. We also saw a lot of material about rabbinic ordination and where rabbinic ordination happens, how it happens, who can get it, all of those sorts of things. And what I want to focus on in the material that we'll look at today is the transition that we started to see with yesterday's daf into what's called dinei nefashot, right? Cases that are about cases that could be punishable by death, right? So everything before that was generally needed a smaller number of judges, and as you know, it makes sense with when life and death is at hand. Now we have a larger number of judges. We have 23, and what I want to do today is within dinei nefashot, within those capital cases, is focus on one small piece of one small sugya, not even sugya, one small piece of Gemara that we saw that I think is on its own a really interesting question that the Gemara asks, and we'll see that a lot of people sort of try and flesh out why exactly the question is being asked. What I also like about what we're going to look at today is that I think it touches on one of the challenges of studying this Masechet, one of the challenges of studying Masechet Sanhedrin, which is that a lot of these laws are certainly no longer in practice, and perhaps have not been in practice for 2,000 years, perhaps never were in practice. It's a sort of complicated story of Jewish autonomy when it comes to court systems. So I think what we're going to see is sort of a meta question within Sanhedrin of what's going on with these cases that happened so long ago, and how might we still be able to learn from them today? So I want to start with the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah that gets quoted a little bit earlier, right? So could I have someone this is only a small piece of the Mishnah. I have the opening line and then the relevant piece for the material we're going to look at. Could I have someone to raise their hand in order to read just our Mishnah?
Oh, no teacher has ever asked for that
Oh,
before.
really? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
This is more like a physical classroom.
Great. I
Can
can
you
go.
increase the size a little
Yeah.
bit so
Yeah,
we can
absolutely.
for those reading off a screen?
Absolutely.
Would someone like to go ahead and read Mishnah Sanhedrin 1:4?
Great. Rob, go right ahead.
Cases concerning offenses punishable by death are decided by 23. The ox that is stoned is judged by 23, as it says, the ox shall be stoned, and also its owner shall be put to death, as is the death of the owner. So too is the death of the ox.
Great. Okay. So we have, generally speaking, dinei nefashot, capital offenses are judged by 23, right? And then one specific example of that is the shor haniskal, right? The ox that is stoned. This is good review material for those of you who are here for Bava Kama at this point, quite a long time ago, right? That you have, this is an ox that has killed someone, right? And that ox is killed, right, by 23. And we have this comparison that the Mishnah makes between the death of the owner, meaning the death of a human being that needs 23 judges, and so too the death of the ox needs a court of 23 judges, right? That's the comparison that the Mishnah goes ahead and makes. Just great. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into the piece of our sugya, right? There's just a brief verse that is going to be quoted by the Gemara itself. That I'll just read this brief verse. The context here is we're at Ma'amad Har Sinai. We're at Mount Sinai, and the what's happening is Hashem has said that no one can ascend onto Mount Sinai. No one can go up onto the hill. Okay, so the verse is, right, without being touched by either by either stoned or shot, beast or person, a trespasser shall not live. Right, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mount. Right, so here this stoned or shot, this is what happens to someone who goes up onto the hill, right? And in the Hebrew, im behema im ish, right? Whether an animal or a person, if either an animal or a person goes up onto the mountain, they're going to be either stoned or shot. Okay, that's the law that comes down here in the verse. And this is what's going to lead us into the question that our sugya asks. Okay, could I have maybe another volunteer to read this brief sugya? Great, Leah.
A
Go ahead.
dilemma was raised. By how many judges would an ox at Mount Sinai have been judged? Whoops, just a minute. Let me get that out of the way. Do we derive a halakha that applies only to a specific time from a halakha that applies for all generations, and accordingly any animal that is to be stoned is judged by 23 judges, or not? Come and hear a solution from that which Rami Bar Yechesiel taught. The verse states, whether animal or man, it should not live. Just as a person is judged by 23, so too an animal is judged by 23.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Leah. So the question that's asked here is, we already know from the Mishnah that generally speaking, an ox that kills a human being is killed by, is judged by a court of 23 judges, right? And now the Gemara asks this question: how many judges would have been necessary for an ox that went up onto Mount Sinai when it wasn't supposed to have done so, right? That's the question. And so what I want to ask just before we move on to the next piece is what, and I'll take some hands or some comments in the chat, whatever works best, right? What do you make of this question, right? Do you think that this question sort of flows naturally from the verse in Exodus and also from the material in our Mishnah. What strikes you about this question? And Virginia, is that a hand? Is that a comment? Virginia, you're still muted.
Well, I always regarded that as kind of ridiculous, that an ox and a human could be judged as equal.
Yeah, right. And also, right, as Aaron puts in the chat here, right, what is the animal's defense? Right? How is someone supposed to defend the animal and say that it did or did not go up onto the mountain? Yeah. Okay, so Lynn says something interesting. The sages don't see to get in this. Yeah. Don't see to get into this obvious question. They're just riffing off the literal words in the Torah. Right. So Lynn, what I think you're saying, and this is a really good point, is that it seems like the rabbis are in asking this question, just trying to best understand what's happening in the Torah, right? Or they're trying to use material that we have in the Talmud in order to sort of reflect back onto material in the Torah, right? I think it's a really good observation. Any other comments about what's going on? Things that strike you about this question, the way that it's answered. So I see Bruce in the chat. Right, another way to look at it is that God's instructions in Mount Sinai are extraordinary, right? It supersedes everything. An ordinary conversation would not hold. Okay, right. So maybe, right, I think what's difficult is that even a general ox, I guess, that kills a person is judged by 23, right? But I think what you're saying, Bruce, is everything that happens at Mount Sinai is just totally right. And this is also, I think this will come up again in the material that we'll see in a moment, right? Is Mount Sinai is sort of sui generis, right? Sort of like totally its own world. And, maybe you could say something like it can never be compared to anything else, right? Which is difficult because that's what the rabbis are doing, right? But it certainly seems like Mount Sinai is just a singular moment, right? Does it matter who owns the animal and where was he, meaning where was the owner? So it's an interesting question, right? It's sort of, right. This gets into the question of also the more generic ox that gores and kills someone, right? If that ox was mu'ad, right? This is really good review for some of those Bava Kama folks, right? If the shore had been forewarned, and then it goes out and kills again, then the owner of the ox is killed as well, right? So the owner piece really is a important piece of what's going on here, right? Okay, just looking at the right or reverse, trying to use Torah verses to get where they want to go. Right. So in which direction, this is Robert, right? So in which direction is this happening? Is this trying to understand the Torah and using the Talmud to do so, or is it trying to understand the Talmud and using the Torah to do so, right? I think that those directions are really interesting to think about. All right, Charles asks, how is an ox to know that it wasn't supposed to go up there? Right, and then Betsy's question about the but that's okay, it's a different case. Right, but so this gets back to Linda's point, right? How is the ox supposed to know not to go up onto Mount Sinai? Seems like it's incumbent on the owner to keep the ox away from the mountain, right? That's what it seems is going on. Right, which then gets to the question, if we say that the ox that goes up has to be killed and is judged by a court of 23, does that also include the owner of the ox in the same way that the owner of the ox might be included in the case of the ox that kills a person, right? All of these things to say is there's like major conflation happening, right, in really confusing ways, right? And I think this is what all of these comments and questions are getting to, really in confusing conflation about how do we learn from the goring ox about the Mount Sinai ox, the Mount Sinai ox to the goring ox, right? It's messy, right? I think all of your points are making that clear. Right, I'm just looking at some of the comments in the last few minutes. Right, Lynn says the rabbis generally don't like the extreme and even then obsolete and impractical measures in the Torah. The law had not yet been expounded by Moses while he was up on Sinai, so why would it apply God's words notwithstanding? Right, so when do these words apply, and how much weight do we give sort of the Torah after Mount Sinai versus what's happening at Mount Sinai? What is the rule of law for a child trespassing or killing? So for that, I'll say that it's not exactly clear that it would be different than an adult person. But on that, I'll ask you to wait for the 8th chapter of Masechet Sanhedrin Ben So'er Moreh, which doesn't address this question, but definitely addresses the question of responsibility of a minor and whether they can be liable for capital crime. So it's a great question, and hold on for maybe a month or so. Okay. Just similar problems today with people and their dogs, right? The human end of the leash, right? Absolutely. The court of 23 at Mount Sinai, right? So the question of how a court would have been convened and Yitro, all really good questions, right? Great. I think in the interest of time, we're gonna move forward. Okay, so we're now moving down to page 2. And we're going to look, this is a brief Tosfot, right? The medieval commentators on the Talmud. And the Tosfot, for some of you who maybe have been paying attention to this, Tosfot do a lot of different things in their comments. Their comments take a lot of different forms. One of the things that they do is ask really good questions. Those questions are not always answered in ways that you might find sufficient, but they ask really good questions. And I think sometimes it's helpful to look at the Tosfot as sort of a continuation of the Gemara, right? If the Gemara were to continue, if there were to be another challenge, right, that isn't included in the Talmud itself, right, that's what Tosfot is coming in and trying to sort of insert, right? And that's, I think, what they do here. Okay, so this is Tosfot's question, right? If you say, right, if you have the challenge, why are we asking about the ox at Sinai? Since what can we learn from it? What happened already happened. Perhaps it's necessary in order to understand the verses, right? So Tosfot asks, why does it matter what would have happened, how many judges there would have been for the ox at Sinai, right? Sinai already happened. It's a singular event. It's only going to happen one time. So why do we need to know, for sort of practical legal purposes, how many judges would have been necessary at Mount Sinai? Right? That's their question. Right? Which I think is a really good question, right? And is a question that, right, I didn't bring the entire Tosfot here. It's much longer. I brought just a brief piece of it. But what Tosfot bring up is there are other places in the Talmud, places that if you've been doing Daf Yomi long enough, you've seen, where the Gemara, the Talmud itself, asks this question, right? So it asks, for instance, in Yoma, it asks about, there's a long conversation about the priestly garments, right? And one of the things they say is, why do we need to know anything about the priestly garments? Like, it already happened, right? And it has different answers for what's going on there. But I think, right, and then the answer, Tosfot's answer here, we're going to see a few different answers to this question. I'd be curious in the chat over the course of the next 9 minutes if there's anything that stands out to you as how you might answer this question, right? Tosfot's answer, and I'll just say it's also the answer here of the Yad Ramah, right? Basically it's the same answer, which is maybe we just are trying to understand the verses, right? We talked about this. This came up a few minutes ago in the comments, right? That maybe the Gemara is the Talmud is just trying to best understand what's happening in the Torah. And in order to best understand what's happening in the Torah, sometimes we need to ask questions and have conversations about things that are going to have no practical impact in our lives, right? Things that are never going to happen again, but we want to sort of understand these things as best we can. I'm going to check the chat quickly. I'm looking for precedents. Right, good. Good. Okay, so we're going to look now at two more ways of just looking at Aaron. I think the rabbis believe looking for precedents is important, even if they don't find them. Right. So maybe we learn the sort of generic law about a goring ox, an ox who kills, right, from this case of Mount Sinai, right? Even though the Mount Sinai case is different than anything else that's going to come afterward. Definitely could be. Okay. So let's see here. Let's move on. We're gonna look at, I think, two more answers to this question. Right? It's a little unclear, I would say, if some of these answers are in direct response to the Tosfot, or if people are sort of coming up, trying to deal with these questions sort of independently. Right? This is the Meiri. This is the late 13th century, so after the Tosfot that we saw. Right? And it's going to bring the same challenge. If you say, what does this have to do with us? What happened, happened, right? Same language as the Tosfot, right? We can explain it as the one who vows to clothe as many poor people as the number of judges that were needed to adjudicate the ox at Sinai, right? So what the Meiri says is, maybe, I don't know who would do this, but maybe there could be someone who takes a vow that they're going to clothe or provide food for as many poor people as there were judges needed. It's a very strange vow to take. But let's say that someone could take such a vow. I'm not actually saying this, but I'm going to clothe as many poor people as there were judges at Mount Sinai. Right? Then it becomes quite relevant how many judges there were at Mount Sinai, because that person needs to know how many poor people to clothe. Right? That's the Meiri's sort of, actually, yes, there is, right? This is different than the answer we saw before. The answer we saw before was, we're trying to best understand what's happening in the Torah, right? Which is to say that it doesn't have, right? In this answer here with the Tosfot about understanding the verses, right? There doesn't seem to be any practical legal implication, right? But with the Meiri, there is practical implication because someone could take this type of vow. All right, so that's a little bit of a different way of thinking about it. All right, and then he gives one more. Some explain it as it is explained in the Talmud Yerushalmi. I couldn't find this actual source, so I'm not sure exactly where he's got this reference, but there's certainly material that medieval rabbis had that we don't have access to today, or maybe it's elsewhere, right? So now it's going to be, so now he quotes the verse, right? That the animal is to be shot, right? This is from our verse in Exodus that we saw earlier, right? So this sort of doubling language, shot, yes, shot, comes to include Shiloh and the temple, right? I'll explain in a second. And it asks, the ox at Sinai by how many? Since if an ox enters Shiloh or the temple, the matter will be clear that its judgment should be like the ox at Sinai, judged by 23. Right? So now, this understanding is, this comes to teach us that if an ox were to enter the temple, right? This is also with the understanding that we need to be ready for halacha for when there is a temple, right? That now we know through this discussion about the ox at Sinai that such an ox that enters the temple in the future would be judged by a court of 23. Okay. I'm just going to look at the chat before we look at the last source. right? The clothing the poor commentary sounds sarcastic, right? Or someone using overly poetic language in their vow, not realizing how many poor people they were committing to. Yeah, I think, right. I think you're, now, right, and Aaron says they're determined to make everything meaningful, so they'll stretch too far. Right, so I think it's, right, what I sort of feel in this is that the Meiri reads the Tosfot and says, right, what's happening here is we're really trying to understand the Torah. And the Meiri says, no, we need to have some sort of practical legal implication, right? The Meiri isn't ready to accept that we could be learning something in the Talmud and not have some sort of practical implication in our lives, even though Mount Sinai was thousands of years ago, right? And so he comes up with this case of the vow, right? It is sort of, flowery poetic language. It is, it does sort of seem like a stretch case, but I think the Meiri does seem, to me at least, to be committed to practical implication. Right. One more brief source here, very, very similar to the Meiri, right? And I think this is a good place to start to wrap up, because this is an understanding that, or an answer that we're going to see. I mentioned Ben Sorero Moreh, the 8th chapter of Sanhedrin, which is coming up in a month or so, 2 months maybe. And I think that, and what we're going to see here is an answer that, if you stay in Sanhedrin long enough, you'll come back and hear again, right? So this is the Ran. This is another medieval source, right? And if you say, what do we learn from this? What happened happened, right? Same language that we've been seeing, right? One could say that it is in order to interpret and receive reward, right? Drosh ukabel schar, right? This is the phrase here in Hebrew: interpret and receive reward. Okay, this exact language, drosh ukabel schar, is going to be used again, as I said, in the 8th chapter, exactly that language, right? And I think it's the Talmud's way of saying, look, there are many things happening here that we don't do today that seem to not have practical implication, right? In that case, they're talking about the case of the rebellious son, right? But the Ran here is saying, actually, we have cases elsewhere in the Talmud, elsewhere in this very Masechet, in this very tractate, that seem to not have any practical implication. And at the same time, by continually trying to interpret it and trying to sort of juice every little bit that we can from the Torah and from the Talmud, right? That's what really helps us receive reward. That's what helps us both keep the Torah and the Talmud relevant, and also make sure that there could be things that you see that seem dated, that seem irrelevant, but we are going to try to find something there. I'm just going to look briefly at the chat before we close. All right, Neil says, seems vaguely like algebra when there are unknown variables that can be solved using known ones, right? Or imaginary numbers. Yeah, there are definitely a lot of unknown variables going on. So I think where I'll leave us here is, we're going to see over the course of learning this Masechet that there are all sorts of pieces that don't seem relevant, don't seem like they have practical implication. And I think the impetus is on us, just like the impetus was on the rabbis of the Talmud, to try and find meaning, to try and find relevance in places where it seems a little unlikely. So thank you. It was great to learn with you today, and have a great last few hours of Hanukkah and a great Shabbos.
Thank you so much for filling in for us today, Max, and you're getting lots of appreciation in the comments. I hope you get a chance to read those before I'm going to turn it off in a minute for everybody. Lovely to see you all. Happy last day of Hanukkah. I hope you join us this Sunday night. We're going to celebrate the 5th anniversary of this cycle of Daf Yomi with a quick run through 23 tractates. I've given the presenters 3 minutes per tractate. Should be light and fun and celebratory, but also a really fun way to review and look back over all the amazing ground that we have covered. And even if you have not been here since the beginning, the Daf Yomi cycle is really circular, right? And the Talmud, the order doesn't matter all that much. So if you want to think of it rather as a preview for the next cycle, you can think of it that way too. You're also very, very welcome. So lovely to see you all. We'll be in your inbox at 5 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning and in this space in a week in addition. Take care, everybody.